What is collective intelligence when we're thinking about strange intelligences? What strange cultures exist that allow us to either grow and expand or perhaps stay very much in the box in which we are operating? Today's talk is with Tim Walker, who is an expert in working with cultural institutions, various capital and small C's. And he is actually a friend of mine, and we regularly have conversations like the one you're about to see, exploring the world in various ways. And I thought it'd be fun to actually have that conversation and share that with you today. So, Tim, thanks a lot for coming today. One of the strangest and most fabulous intelligences that I know in my field. Tim, for those of you watching, Tim Walker is a strategic consultant, an expert in wrangling creatives and cultural institutions and organisations. He's somebody I've known for a few years now. And one of the things I love, Tim, is you and I having really good conversations about collective intelligence and systems, and particularly creative systems which involve creative intelligence as well, right? We're here as part of the Strange Intelligences Lab, interviewing people who are kind of in that interesting space between disciplines, or who are facilitating the spaces between disciplines. And I think you're one of those people. When I think of that, I immediately go to your practice. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself, Tim, and what you do?
Sure. Kura. So my background is in museums and galleries, and that included being the senior curator of art through the development of Te Papa, which obviously is an integrated institution in name. And for the last 15 years, 16 years, I've been working as a consultant, as you say. The core of my practice really is working with organisations and individuals to try and really think about their core story. What is that compelling kind of verb? What is that compelling story that and the impacts they seek to have, which usually is different from the things that they have thought about in terms of their practice to date.
I was having a conversation with our producer, Jared Taylor, just before you came on, and talking about histories and stories and how that is always mitigated by rank and who's the one telling the story and how the story gets told and all the untold stories. Do you see your role as uncovering untold stories, Tim? Like, how do you see your role in that story place?
I think it is. It's revealing things that are implicitly there. But in terms of the way people have been brought up and grown up to think, they don't have a natural curiosity around the questions that would lead them to really dig into what the richness of the story might be. So there's a tendency for people either to work in a very kind of they don't really want to explore things. They want someone basically just to reinforce what they've already explored. They're not particularly curious about getting to deeper levels. And that often actually, interestingly, is because they're not particularly curious about having bigger impact. So, I always think that the deeper you understand your values and your core story, the more expansive your impact can be in the world. But we tend to have quite largely because the New Zealand arts ecosystem is dependency funded, basically funded from the state. There can be a tendency for people to think more about how can I just do more of what I already know I want to do.
And in terms of collective intelligence, I guess there's lots of ways. I'm not interested in debating definitions of it because, Indigenous groups, scientists, digital cultural theorists, everyone has their own view about what collective intelligence is. I'm interested in how we have been discussing the idea of collective intelligence and what supports it and what doesn't. And I guess what I'm hearing from you is sometimes the rank or power differences between funders or not, or what will allow us to be resourced or not, can be one aspect that supports people to be innovative and to grow in their intelligence, and sometimes not. Is that what you're saying, Tim? Or?
Well, I think that in a Western community, we tend to grow up defining ourselves by the box that we fit in, and there's very little curiosity often about the spaces that sit between the boxes. Most funding mechanisms reinforce funding box by box by box. And so that can unwittingly create almost a competition between performing arts versus fashion versus painting versus craft. So I suppose at the core of my practice and my thinking is that it's the spaces between the relational spaces that hold all of the richness and all of the necessity in terms of the way the world is changing, and yet the way in which the world is arranged and sees itself and organizes itself is actually the opposite. It's very atomized, it's very silo-based. And so it's kind of really understanding how organizations can think of themselves and their work and their impact in a more kind of interconnected, more nodal kind of way of thinking about who they work with, for how they work, rather than simply kind of working within the rules of the box within which they've grown up.
How do you do that? Like, what are the things that work? In the career that you've had, when you go into an organisation and let's say they're really stuck and they're unable to see outside of what they're doing and they've lost sight of pretty much who they are. What are some of the ways that it works? I mean, I'll share from my perspective as well, because it's not just drilling on you, but what from your perspective do you think works, Tim?
I think what works is so in the end, I believe that, like transformational leadership is founded on asking the right questions rather than actually how do we do something we've always done a little bit better. So I think what it relies on is moving away from a focus, a complete focus on what we exist to do, to the perennial idea of why are we doing it, what impacts are we seeking to. So to create some provocation, some curiosity, some aspiration around what could our work result in, as opposed to how do we keep doing our work. So the idea of what's needed, what could be, what would be the worst thing that happened if we tried A or B, driving what actually is, what work is done and what outcomes are achieved, rather than actually doubling down on investing in the kind of the paradigm within which you've always worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of that sounds good, but you and I both know that that's really tricky to get groups to the point where they're willing to do that, I think, sometimes, like the intelligence can sometimes be less than some of the parts, not necessarily more than some of the parts.
That's right, all too easily. And I think, the 10 years where I was a director of the Dowse, which was a craft museum in Lower Hutt, and after 10 years, our focus was on the kind of transformational power of creativity in everyday life, socially, spiritually, and economically. So it was quite a big shift. Internally, that's the way the culture grew, and the culture grew around very clear sense of purpose, drive. So what people would have seen from the outside is a very, very varied and transdisciplinary outcome. And it was definitely seen by, say, the more orthodox players within the art museum sector as heretical and dumbed down, and as soon as I left, it very quickly reverted to being what I would say is a very orthodox idea of what a contemporary art gallery is. But internally, the team that we built around the questions we asked ourselves, the way we worked together, the titles we used for each other, which were traditional titles and so forth, basically created a team culture where we would pull off a project that seemed impossible from the outset. And as soon as it was pulled off, there would be a sense of like, how on earth did we pull that off? But within a week or two, there would be the beginnings of the questions coming from the team. What's next? What's the next explorational kind of? So I think my experience is that it's a leadership thing. It's building a co-leadership culture around a methodology that really is kind of inquiry based, with an understanding that there are a complexity of factors that we're thinking about at any one time. And that means that people with different skill sets and different ways of seeing all bring something absolutely vital to the table. So it's different from the curator coming up with the show and then the marketing person working out how to market it, and the collection manager working out how to manage the collections in respect of it. It's actually about a collective creative process, understanding there's a relatively complex series of factors that we're trying to solve at once.
It's interesting. I mean, I guess I'm thinking organisations that I perceive to be thriving are the ones who do inquire. They are learning. I mean, it's a bit sort of 90s now, but thinking about continuous learning and organisational cultures that grow, or that have leaders that encourage people to bring new ideas in a way that's not too disruptive, but because that could be its own problem, but that encourage permeable boundaries, for example, for me, seem to be the ones that are a little bit more agile, a little bit more resilient, and more able to adapt. They're able to kind of think outside the bubble they've created for themselves.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge, and I think we see it right across New Zealand now, the huge kind of focus on left brain, kind of milestones, project management, tick box, and so forth. And the tick box has become the main focus rather than the milestones on the way to actually achieving something astonishing. I know that when I started in that role at the Dowse, and I hadn't been a director of an organisation before, but I had come through 10 years of Te Papa and development of Te Papa, so I kind of had a really good immersion in a completely different set of questions about what it was to be a curator. But I remember the workshop with the staff on the first day, and I said, look, let's imagine we're in the trenches on one side of the World War One kind of no man's land. So what we're going to do today is we're not going to spend the whole day working out the reasons why we can't possibly put our head above the parapet. What we're going to do is fly right out into the middle of no man's land, and my guarantee in response is that we will pull back from there to a place where we feel safe. But I'm not going to spend the whole day, because I only know the power of resistance. You need to harness it rather than simply allow it to say, we can't. And what was really interesting, by the end of that day, we'd gone out to the middle of no man's land, and actually the collective will was to move forward rather than pull back. But I also know if I hadn't done that, we would have spent the whole day fundamentally kind of not leaving the trench. So I think part of it is, and then it is about framing questions. At one point, in a subsequent workshop, I asked, there was a small team of about 12, but I asked in teams of 3 for the people to draw a picture of the relationship between the organisation and their communities, and these are all council-funded arts organisations, as expressed in their mission statement and purpose statements. And the drawings that came back were literally, like a finger pointing out of a cloud with no land whatever behind. The other one was a lighthouse with the light coming out above clouds, and so all of them were about that we transform the community and we are the light, the truth, and the way kind of. And then from that, we actually drew what a systems kind of based mission statement would be for the organisation, and then we turned it into language. And throughout the development of the projects, we used that drawing and that kind of the interrelationship between things. As the way of which we actually thought about the complex interplay of, kind of the creatives, whether they were artists or other institutions, the supporters, the communities, and there was another one. But anyway, and we grew the idea that any idea could come from any of those circles. So if suddenly someone, and the staff became, we built a culture where everyone on the staff became curious about where they saw sponsorship popping up in their community, and so they started to understand that language of the values, the way in which values exist across business and community and politics and organisations and artists, so that it was possible to see the way in which an art museum worked being much more in sync and in relation to other parts of society, rather than we're the light at the top of the lighthouse, pointing out, no, believing that we're changing people's lives. So it did create a culture of curiosity and excitement. And I remember at one point we opened a show One was a show we developed with the hip hop community on the hip hop kind of values proposition, and at the same time there was an exhibition we curated from Rosemary McLeod's textile collection in Wellington, which is this incredible history of New Zealand textiles from the depression sacking kind of clothing to the knitted tea cozies to the. And I turned to our exhibitions manager and said, "Oh my God, what kind of art gallery opens these two things at the same time?" And he went, "A cool one to him." But and so straight away with those two exhibitions, for example, you literally in Lower Hutt had elderly woman with blue hair coming to have a cup of tea at the art gallery, having to negotiate their way through on the front steps a group of young Māori men having a smoke who were there for the hip hop show. So, you started to get this quite, and also you started to get older people really, really interested in who this hip hop generation were and what mattered to them. Deeply interested, and where else in society would they be able to, kind of engage in that, kind of come into contact with that.
One of the things we've spoken about before, Tim, is about how rank and power plays out in organisations, and I think a lot of organisations who are aspiring to be cross-disciplinary, either with other groups outside them or internally, have a reasonable degree of unconsciousness about how that stuff plays out internally. And what I mean by that is, for example, in some ways, my experience of working with cultural or arts institutions is that they are as marabound by their own hierarchy and kind of privilege systems as scientific organisations are, and woe betide people who work in between those two spaces, because it feels like there's no meta language that they have to then see what's going on underneath the surface and actually discuss it. And so a lot of unconscious rank things happen, including the fact that a lot of artistic or cultural institutions are contested sites. There's a lot of people who won't go to those places. Yep. They've just got an invisible barrier around them. And it's like, why are people not coming? It's such an awesome show, or this, that, and the other. And it's like, well, a good portion of the community don't feel comfortable here. And there's an unconsciousness about that. Is that your experience as well?
That's absolutely my experience. And I think in terms of the sector is is deeply uncurious about many of these things. So there's an entitlement's the wrong word to use because it's bandied about and it's become almost meaningless. But Pierre Bourdieu, talking about the kind of new museology, he used this wonderful quote, he came up with this wonderful quote, which I always refer to, which is simply that museums define their sense of inclusion and therefore exclusion through the tiniest details of their morphology and organisation. And so this is like the way they inhabit civic squares and actually give credence and credibility to the corporates that are around them, the way in which their brand works, the way in which when you walk in, someone's behind a desk and making you feel like, all of these things. So, and I know Te Papa, I know Te Papa was heretical within the sector, but all of those things were carefully scrutinised and carefully undone. Which of course then leads to criticisms of dumbing down. So there's this kind of a comfort in these buildings remaining aloof and remaining separate and and then, as you say, there's a sense of like, why don't people come? That the work we do will make them better people if only they knew. But there's very, very little, and the term I always use, genuine and generous interest in the lives of the people that the organisations serve. So the organisations are very old-fashioned hub organisations. They are like beacons on a hill. They are that light come from the top of the lighthouse. And we also saw through COVID, we saw, the claim that this is when arts and creativity is so important. But mostly what we saw from the sector were various ways of putting the hand out for funding because we need funding. And really in competition with social needs that were arguably higher than the needs of art galleries and museums through that time, like kind of more housing, food, women's refuge, and so forth. So like you stand back and, most cases, art galleries and museums in the country are paid for staffing and capital by the citizens in that community through rates. And yet that's something that, so what could have been the response by those institutions to something like COVID? I think the thing that for me is most, and I'm writing this book at the moment, I've been reflecting on my career. And throughout my career, I feel like I've always felt I've had one foot in the role in the institution and one foot outside. And I think that's because, as I reflect on it, that our natural intuitive sense of balance is lost if we fully stand inside what are quite orthodox, old-fashioned, and increasingly irrelevant kind of silos. So for me, it's always been a kind of sense of, I got this job and I can do this job, but do I really want to do this job? But I think it's partly because the institutions themselves kind of struggle to exist in a more open and relational kind of context. And so the work that they do becomes unnecessarily kind of limited when actually it could be and should be and needs to be much, much more kind of vital and engaged and relational and kind of interconnected.
It's interesting, if I'm, without going into naming, particular organisations, I'm thinking about the large funding bodies we have in New Zealand and how they fund arts. And I'm interested how they reflect that kind of elitist, kind of hierarchical kind of way of thinking. Like, well, there's these kind of artists, these people are over here. Even with the restructure of various groups like that, we're still seeing this kind of segmentation and a reinforcement. But the second you get out of that, then you have, people who've only been just out of school or they're just starting an art career competing against large institutions for the same funding pool. It's almost like the system's set up so that the different hierarchies kind of coexist, and they still have these lots and little boxes that you're needing to fit within. I mean, most recently doing away with interarts because apparently interarts now just exists in all the other boxes, or we're multidisciplinary, which is what we're not. So, I think that unconsciousness around rank and privilege is challenging. But Tim, on a more positive note, you also work with a lot of Indigenous Māori communities. How do you, without naming obviously any of them, how do you find the contrast in terms of obviously their cultural institutions or their cultural organisations? How do you find the contrast in working with some of them?
Well, I've been really lucky, and often the Māori groups I work with are really hapu, working on a kind of a project. And the big difference really is that the way of thinking, the way of working collectively, the way of wānanga, of listening, and at times it's incredibly exasperating for the person in that hapu who's trying to move something forward, because that's the practices that everyone gets to have their say. And often the people on the teams are actually doing this hapu project over and above their 9-to-5 job. So it's deeply, and the other thing is there's this deep understanding that it's on behalf of those who have come before, and it's on behalf of those who are yet to come. So that multi-generational, multidisciplinary, multiple bottom line, multiple kind of value outcomes is implicit, rather than something that needs to be constantly brought to the centre. So I think it provides a way. So if I'm in that situation and facilitating, it's suddenly a certain type of questioning opens up such richness, which then leads to the kind of what the follow-up question might be, or the insights that are triggered within the group, because there's a fundamental reservoir, richness, heritage, whakapapa of ways of thinking that are needed for the conversation that's occurring. So that's completely at odds with often working with organisations that aren't Māori. And I think, it's interesting you use the word interarts, because when I was thinking about it today, I just keep coming back to that word inter, the idea of intertwined, interrelational, interconnected, interchange, interplay. And I think that's the heart of what's missing. So that I was just because of work I'm doing on the book I'm writing at the moment. There's a lot of stuff inside English entomology, which, if you dig back into, has been lost through the period of colonization. So in many ways, the English have colonized their own richness of their own language and actually become. So there's this word intelligence, which, as you probably know, comes from the intelligere, which really means, I've got it here. So from inter and root. So what is it? Oh, here we go. Understanding from reading between. So intelligence is understanding from reading between, and a thing in its context within a whole network of interconnections. So that's the root of the word, and yet what we take it to mean, and what it means, and what it becomes the authorizing demon of, is actually disciplines, specialisms, silos. So it's actually the opposite of actually what the root of the word is. There's also a beautiful, in Japanese, the word for human being isNingen, and it actually translates into the relation between people. So the interrelationship, the word for human being is the interrelationship between people. And obviously you see this in Māori, Pacific, other indigenous. So it's a fundamental different understanding of the space between things as opposed to the things themselves. I know this working with artists who are more interested in process of making than product, even though everything about the art world and the funding you're talking about and the boxes is related to production and output. So we're kind of stuck in this situation with arts funding in New Zealand where there's not enough, there's not going to be any more, and yet there hasn't been the support or encouragement of a much, much more entrepreneurial way of building value around the arts. And so that has actually tended to calcify the practice of the arts into actually, relatively high quality, but relatively limited kind of expressions in a way. So the relationship between entrepreneurial and creative is so far away, generally speaking, from what we see as supporting the arts. And yet, everything I do is fundamentally premised on the idea that arts and creativity is so important, will become more important. But I don't think the way in which we support the arts actually is premised on that.
No. I mean, there's a few different things you touched on there, and I'm noticing or thinking about Awhi World, and as a kind of a low-level activism, all of the things we do is work in progress. We like showing insight into process, because my practice is process-oriented. As a consultant, I'm always interested in process. I'm interested in the spaces between things, not the things themselves. It's how I've seen the world since I was quite small. So we like to have things, but it's challenging in that environment to think about that. And also, it's also interesting because I don't count myself as an artist, so I can kind of see the world that it evolves. And certainly, there's an edge around people doing too well from their practice. It's like, that person's sold out, or that person's art's too commercial, or there's a whole interesting little sub-genre or sub-dynamic that almost prevents people from doing well because their art is then seen almost too commodified. And then it keeps everyone at a similar level. In Awhi World at the moment, we're experimenting with having lots of different things, some of which are commercial, some of which are not, sponsored, etc. So it's been a real critical process to kind of go, okay, at what point do we feel our ranks or our own thing is being compromised by this funding or this person being involved, etc. We're trying to critically analyze it. I think if you have a critical awareness of what you're doing, it's great, but the challenge is a lot of people don't. They're kind of subject to their own profession or subject to their own discipline or culture even. They don't have a foot out the door, as you said, Tim, to be able to then go, oh, hold on a second, something's a bit odd here. Let me just process on that a bit. Because something, even if it doesn't feel right, you can just take a moment, step outside the stream and look at the stream, right? But a lot of people are in the stream just going, it's like, this is the only stream. There's not 7 other streams.
Well, that's right. And I think, the thing you touched on about the commercial and the creative, and there's a huge sense of risk and self-censorship in the creative or the cultural ever kind of would implicitly be compromised by the commercial. It's money changes in the temple kind of, and we've got to keep the church separate from, the kind of the shopping mall. And it's such a restrictive, particularly when we look at so many of the platforms and technologies and media within which and on which creativity happens are implicitly commercial. So, there's such, and also we see, the rise of TikTok and social media and, the platforms where people might be creative are implicitly commercial. So I always think that's been a huge, I know again, going back to the Dowse, we did a project which was really about, because, stimulating creativity, transformations in creativity that, drive human life. And we did a project with Youth Creative Business. So this was a project with the Huffers, Loop, City is Fix, a knitwear company, and so on. And the kind of kickback for us, because the idea from artists, that money's for us, that should be for us. What was ironic is that because we were working in that space, first of all, we gained a sponsorship with Westpac, and secondly, we got a big grant from New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. And that money, of course, wouldn't have come into the system if it was for artists of the sort that were saying that we should only, And what was transformative about it was that Westpac, like this huge Australian-owned bank, through a small art gallery in Lower Hutt, doing this project, they came back to us and said our business relationship managers never ever understood the youth economy. And we, and at the same time, when Brother D from Dawn Raid came in and talked to our young staff, they said to us it was the most exciting presentation I'd ever had. And that was because suddenly they understood the bank and that the Employers and Manufacturers Associations did the same thing, where they can put business mentors into youth companies, and they tend to come back saying these kids are so lazy they don't know what they're doing. But what they realised was the mentors didn't understand the business mindset and model of the younger business people, which is actually based on the value of niches as opposed to the value of big market share. So the question is, so an art museum shouldn't be doing that, but if it's not, who is doing it? And in the paucity of, the space that starts to catalyze conversations across, it's if we don't do these things, they're so critical, because fundamentally you have you have a small number of people coming through high school who are going to go on to be artists. You have potentially a bigger number of people who could go on to be in creative business if they had any understanding of actually what that looked like and what the bridge was.
I agree with you. Tim, you're working on a book, as you've mentioned a couple of times now. Tell me more about what's in there. What do you think the value of that book will be to others to read, and how far are you away from publishing?
Well, the last question, I'm probably a good year away from publishing, but so this is a book about someone called Robley, Horatio Gordon Robley, who I did my art history thesis on in early 80s. And this is a good example of the spaces between. So when I nominated him as an art history thesis, it was suggested I transferred anthropology because he wasn't really an artist. Robley was someone who fought in 1864 at Gate Pa, had a child with a Māori woman, spent all of his time living with the local hapu and doing images and paintings and drawings of things Māori. And later in life, and it's very controversial, when he retired as a Major General, he set about writing a book on Māori tattooing, and in the process of that developed a collection of 40 mokai, toi upuku, like preserved Māori heads from European collections, and then tried to get them back to New Zealand unsuccessfully. But the real story of Robley is that, so the way in which I'm writing the book is actually saying, what if we use Robley in his astonishing kind of engagement with moko and his astonishing belief that moko would re-emerge, And all of his focus was not on human remains, it was on ensuring that Mātauranga relating to moko got back. What if we use his life and extraordinary life as a cipher for re-looking at that period of time, going right back really to the 1830s when the trade in heads was closed and into the future in terms of the re-emergence of moko. So it's much more about, it's given me license to stand back and unthink. I'm not a historian. It's given me time to unthink a linear idea, a chronological idea, the idea of, military, colonialist bad, Māori good. Really to, just think about, this idea. And the word I'm using is anima. So the idea of the living principle of a thing or a moment or a person, and the idea that that thing continues to have life. And that the idea that thing continues to interact with other anima over time and over, across time, across place. And so it's not a very clear explanation of the book, but really it's about, it weaves together his descendants in New Zealand, all of whom are Māori, his work with moko, the re-emergence of moko, the role that his collection coming back to Aotearoa has played in the re-emergence of moko. So it's really a book that it's definitely not a book about him. It's a book centered on him in terms of, again, kind of trying to step outside of the silos of history, of cultural history, of art history, of ethnology and so forth, to actually think about it as a series, it's really a story of energy, if you like, a story of energies. And in a funny way, he's like a medium through which various things connect.
What else do you think is important to know as we sort of finish this chat today, that people who are watching, we've discussed things about the third space or that space between things. We've discussed relationality, about different kinds of systems, about the nature of the systems that we go in and comparing, contrasting them. Is there anything else where you think, if I'm really thinking about advice that people are, for people who are working in institutions or wanting to make change in institutions, what that might be?
I think it's being really clear about the impacts you're seeking to have on who and with who. And the impacts you're seeking to have that are designed and thought about so that what happens as a result. I think the other thing I'm increasingly aware of, as most people are, is the rethinking the kind of neoliberal model of constraints and restraints and growth and so forth, to really understand the limits of the planetary kind of resources and boundaries. And the leadership that all of us need to be involved in and engaged in is actually the recalibration of kind of ways of thinking and being and practicing that actually implicitly seek connectivity and collectivity in terms of addressing in a shared way some bigger challenges. The thing about the arts and creative sector is that they're generally seen as being trusted at arm's length institutions. They have a huge opportunity for leadership. And so I suppose my parting thought is that cultural organisations need to be very focused, not on protecting their collections, not on protecting, or not on a scarcity thing, but on actually who can we work with, who shares our values. Are we clear enough about our values and our purpose to actually begin to build coalitions of effort around bigger things? I think there are more and more entities and organisations and people who want to come to that party. But the thing about, someone has to send the invitation out, someone has to frame the kaupapa, somebody has to say, come and join us for a conversation about X, because that's the thing that creates content connectivity and, transcultural kind of interdisciplinary thinking. Someone has to call the parties together, and then someone has to lead the conversation about what are the individual values of those participants, and how can we get to a point of shared values and shared intent. And the other thing I think to remember is that you only need to do one demonstrable kind of transformative project every so often. You don't have to reimagine the whole organisation to do everything differently. You just need to make sure that the most important project you'll do in the next 5 years is focused on something that's going to move the dial.
Thanks, Tim. Important words at a time where culture, in any sense of the word, is in a very dynamic situation and lots of forces pushing against it. So I think that's, they might be pushing against it, but there's certainly lots of innovation that can happen that pushes back and grows beyond. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.